NAACP and the Peekskill Presbyterian Church. I'm Reverend Stephany Graham, President of the Peekskill Area Pastors Association and also the pastor of this very interesting congregation. Lest we forget, lends to us a time every third Monday for reflection, inspiration, and education. Also, we get a lot of interaction. Sometimes it gets passionate, but we end the evening loving one another and encouraging one another to pursue more information if you have additional questions. Our prayers tonight are with the people of Iraq and also the people who have been affected by the hurricane, Matthew, and our thoughts and prayers are with people all over the world and in this community and in this nation who have been affected by any violence or oppression. And so just take a moment and let's just think about them and stand in solidarity with those who are suffering or disenfranchised anywhere in the world. And that brings us to tonight. Now we know that we have been bombarded with information about the 2016 presidential election. Not just us, but the whole world is looking and is wondering what the outcome is going to be and how it will affect not only this country, but the world at large. We have two panelists with us tonight, and we have anybody here who is interested in representing the Green Party. We will make room for you at the table. Is there anyone? We want to be as balanced as we can possibly be. But let me introduce our guests tonight. First we have Mr. DeBar. Don?
Yes.
He is a radio journalist and political analyst who is a frequent commentator on international affairs and global news outlets such as Russia's RT, First Channel, and the Sputnik News Agency, Iran's FARS News Agency and Press TV, and others around the world. Here in the U.S., he is a frequent contributor to such news and opinion outlets as the Black Agenda Report, Counterpunch, and Pacifica Radio. Don is a lifelong Ossining resident and a former member of the Ossining NAACP chapter that was suspended by the present NAACP leadership due to its advocacy work for imprisoned journalist and former Black Panther Party member Mumia Abu-Jamal. His daily 30-minute newscast, the CPR News, is carried on more than 50 AM and FM radio stations across the country. Welcome, Don. We're glad you're here with us tonight. And you are indeed representing the Republican Party tonight, is that correct?
Yeah, that's the card I drew, yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you. And also with us is Mr. Mike Morey, or Morey? Morey. And he is a managing director at SKDK Knickerbocker, one of the nation's leading political consulting firms. He has spent close to 20 years in communications, public relations, campaign management, and politics. Mike specializes in rapid response, crisis communications, and war room management. And he has worked for more than a dozen campaigns for public office, including campaigns for U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer, Governor Andrew Cuomo, and the former New York City Council Speaker Christine Quinn. Prior to joining SKDK Knickerbocker, Mike served as the New York Communications Director for U.S. Senator Charles Schumer. One of his first major political campaigns was for Secretary Clinton's first campaign for Senate in 2000. He earned his bachelor's from Purchase College and his master's degree from the American University of Washington, D.C. In addition to his communications work, he has taught politics courses at Purchase College, Iona College, NYU, and American University. He is a frequent guest commentator on PBS 13's Metro Focus, Richard French Live, on FIOS 1 News and NY's first Inside City Hall with Errol Lewis. He was born and raised here in Peekskill and now lives in Portland, Maine with his wife and 2 children. Thank you so much for being here tonight with us. Mike. Okay, now on Wednesday night, we are going to hear the last of 3 presidential debates. And most of us have already made up our minds as to who we're going to support in this election, but just in case there's someone here who has not, our panelists will share with us their reasons for why we should vote for the candidate that they are supporting. We're going to let both of our candidates speak, and then we'll hear responses from you. And we'll take some questions, if that's okay.
Great.
And we want to stay focused on policy issues as much as possible tonight and not engage in the circus that we have been experiencing in the news. Mr. DeBar, why should we cast our vote for Donald Trump?
Can you hear me without this? No, I'll use it. How's that? Is that better? Okay. The ritual that we go through every 4 years in the United States that draws the attention of so many people here and around the world because of the role the United States plays in the world has much less to do with the people making decisions about policy than the people who vote believe. And this particular election, I think, that's more true in one sense and absolutely not true in another. It's important to look at the forces that are represented, the segments of the elite that are represented by the candidates in a presidential election and congressional elections. Obviously, with all the money that's involved in politics, that money's being placed behind candidates for specific expected outputs in terms of policy. In this particular election, in my opinion, the most important policy decision that's being made and the most important policy controversy that exists among the elite is whether or not to go to war with Russia and China, and whether or not to continue on a policy of regime change and nation building and interference in the internal affairs of other countries. I'd say, where you want to break, looking, say, from the Reagan administration forward, the Carter administration forward, even the Nixon administration forward, there have been both a consensus among Democrats and Republicans in terms of the political figures and also among the foreign policy elite on U.S. foreign policy, with some friction among different factions. But in general, the construction and maintenance of an empire on a straight line almost from the founding of the country, but certainly over the last 40 years, has been a consensus position of Democratic and Republican presidents, people in the Senate and the House, and that project has gone along more or less uninterrupted until we find ourselves at this moment with wars going on in 4 or 5 countries in the Middle East, nations destroyed, wars going on, 5, 10 countries in Africa, civil war or either being engaged in or at the brink across South America, Brazil, Argentina, other places, and a placement of U.S. and Western military assets along essentially along the periphery of Russia and China from the Baltics to the Korean Peninsula, with weapons hot in some points, in some parts of the Balkans, for example, and others near Russia, of anti-missile systems and things that make the Russians think that the United States has placed the material and the people for a first strike. In Russia right now, for example, they are having civil defense drills like we used to have in the early 1960s, like we had 54 years ago this week, as a matter of fact, with what we call here the Cuban Missile Crisis. There are very distinct positions between the two presidential candidates on these questions, and I actually attended both the Republican National Convention and the Democratic National Convention and got to be an eyewitness to what happened in each place. And I am a media person, so of course I was watching the media portrayal of it, and I can tell you that folks that weren't there or haven't spoken with people, in some considerable detail about what they saw, really have no idea from watching television what happened at either place. The most striking thing I saw, just to open, was at the Republican National Convention with the assembled Republican Party, apparatus, the district leaders and the elected officials that go to political conventions, standing up and giving a standing ovation and cheering for the first time in Donald Trump's speech when he said, "No more regime change and no more nation building." This happens within the context of the regime change in Iraq under George Bush, with the, not just complicity, but with the partnership with people in the Democratic Party, in the Senate and the House, Hillary Clinton being one of them, Senator Schumer being another, Feinstein being another, essentially the entire leadership of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party on this consensus, destroying the nation of Iraq after first invading it in 1990, 1991, then starving and bombing it for a decade during the Clinton administration, and at the end of the Clinton administration essentially implementing a declaration of war. It was functionally a declaration of war. The invasion in 2003, in the face of tens of millions of people around the world going into the streets calling for it to not happen, and everything that's happened since, including what's happening today, where ISIS is being driven from Iraq to Syria. We could get to that later. The destruction of Libya and what that enabled, including the placement of AFRICOM across the African continent, so that now the U.S. military sits in command and control of about 35 African countries. A very peaceful, on its face, with lots of bodies, recolonization of Africa by the United States military. What's been happening in Central and South America over the past, just the Obama administration, a coup d'etat in Honduras, a soft coup in Paraguay, essentially coups in, well, particularly in Brazil, that is a coup, and the soft coup that took place in the election last year in Argentina, and the continued pressure on Venezuela, all coming from the United States, happened during the Clinton administration, happened during the first Bush administration, happened during the second Bush administration, happening now, and happened with Senator Clinton, or Secretary Clinton as Secretary of State. To me, the question of whether or not we have World War III, I think, primes everything else. All other policy discussions after World War III will take place among wisps of radioactive vapor. And in that context, I think that Clinton, the neocons and neoliberals aligned around her that support her, are the most dangerous force in the political arena right now.
And what exactly is Mr. Trump's policy that would avoid all of that?
Well, okay. First, I'm going to start with a paraphrase. It's not a quote of something that President Bashar al-Assad said in an interview about a month ago. And he was asked, "What is your preference?" It was, I think, an NBC reporter was trying to bait him into saying he supported Trump so that they could then pin Assad, the dictator, on Trump like they've tried to do with Putin. And he said, we outside of your country look at politicians in the United States, hear what they say, and think nothing about what that means, because generally what they say has absolutely nothing to do with the policies that they'll actually implement. And we got a taste of that, in addition to that, in the emails of Hillary Clinton's, by the way, where she said, you have a public policy and you have a private policy. Assad said on January 20th, 2017, you will have a new president. They will implement policy, and then we will react to it. So, all we can go on right now is what they say, knowing all of that. Hillary Clinton right now says Russia is the great danger, Russia is hacking the election, Russia is this, Russia is that, Russia is dangerous. President Obama has installed the forces that I described before. That took place over a long period of time in terms of membership in NATO, things that started during the Clinton administration last time, to where NATO is now up at Russia's borders. But the placement of troops, of active weapon systems, that's all taken place in the last 4 years, 3 years. That's Obama administration. That was Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. And Trump says, and that's all we have to go on, war with Russia is a bad idea, we should do business with them. War with China is a bad idea, we should do business with them. There should be no more regime change, there should be no more Iraq, Syria, Libya, the list. And if you're going to vote based on someone's position on these things, you have to, I don't trust either of them. But I do know what Clinton's going to do because it's being done. And somebody else that says they're not going to do it, that's the choice we get.
Any immediate questions for Mr. DeBar?
Sure.
You shared a lot, so I don't want to lose.
That's okay, yeah.
Regarding Mr. Trump's opinion on Iraq, for example, he didn't think it was wrong that we went in Iraq. The only thing he thought we did wrong was not take their oil.
Well,
that's what he said.
With American politicians, you have the record, you have what they say, you have, there's a lot, and it's usually all contradictory. So it's hard to parse even a position out of it because they say one thing today, another tomorrow, and often they do something else. Trump, whatever he said about the Iraq War before it happened, shortly afterwards, he said whatever he said, which sort of backed off of it. What I do know is this. There's a record of what Hillary Clinton said and how she voted in October of 2002. There's a record of what every member of the Senate said and how they voted, and every member of the House of Representatives. Trump wasn't among them, and Hillary Clinton was. Not only that, she was, as they told us when Bill Clinton was elected, it was a twofer when we got them. And she was very actively involved in the administration, in lobbying Congress, and doing public relations work, and doing policy research, and in expressing policy. And the policy of the Clinton administration was to starve the people of Iraq. The Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who was front and center at the Democratic National Convention last July, was on 60 Minutes after Iraq was being starved, told by one of the people at 60 Minutes, there are some that say at the United Nations that something like 400,000 Iraqi children have died as a result of the sanctions that your administration has imposed. Do you think it's worth it? And she said, well, it's really not, I'm paraphrasing, it's not a great thing that it happened, but yeah, it's worth it. So, what Trump thought before, during, or after, while he's, building casinos or filing bankruptcy or whatever he was doing in October 2002 or early 2003, what Hillary Clinton was doing is a matter of record, and the people of Iraq, a couple of million of them are dead as a consequence of that. Yeah, you're not going to get an argument from me about whether or not these people are full of it. All of them. But, I'm looking at, if we're talking about policy, I'm looking at, record policy, and that's what we have. I'm sorry. Well, actually, he stated that there would be no more regime change and nation building. Again, that's what he says now.
Okay, we're going to take another brief comment and let Mr. Morey speak, okay?
I got a question.
Hey.
How is it that Hillary Clinton, who was in the Obama administration, how is it that she's supporting the forces that she says are in Al-Qaeda, in Syria, with Nusra, which is a former
It depends. I'm not a military strategist, but when you look at a map and you start trying to, fill these things in and try to conceive of all these different little wars that, as a war, it's something that when I was a kid and people were looking at World War II, they thought of it as like this, large, unitary thing, but you had the war in Europe, you had war in Asia, you had war in other places too. And I'm assuming Eisenhower and Bradley and those people had a big picture view of the whole, because they had to decide where they're going to put these assets, those assets, or whatever. But looking at that area, it's hard to not come to the conclusion that when they decide to, looking at what's happening in Iraq right now, I started to allude to it before, they're going to basically drive ISIS out of one city in Iraq, and they're driving it into the other theater in Syria. Not destroying it in the desert. I don't know how many people remember in 1991 when those of us who remembered Vietnam were saying, hey, you go into Iraq, you're going to have another extended war, another quagmire. And we were laughed at because there was a jungle there, you can't see anything, it's a desert. They move, you bomb them, that's that. Well, unless they're driving in magic Toyota pickup trucks or whatever, then they're not so easy to bomb. ISIS is being driven to Syria right now. And if you look at that in the context of what's happening in Syria, it's hard to not walk away with the impression that what's happening is reinforcements are being sent in to fight the Syrian government. So what's happening in Yemen, and you have different, official political conditions and legal conditions to deal with between Yemen and Syria. For example, even though the guy that is reported as being the president of Yemen isn't, his term was up, he fled the country. He's been out of the country a lot longer than Yanukovych was before he was declared not the president of Ukraine. They hold him out, though, that this is the Yemeni government and these guys are Houthi rebels or whatever, instead of this is, these are the people of Yemen and this guy that's hiding in Saudi Arabia is some pretender. So you don't have a government recognized by the United Nations, for example, as the legitimate government of Yemen. They can say, okay, well, come in and help us and you guys stay out, like you have in Syria, where the United States is acting illegally in Syria because the Syrian government, recognized by the United Nations, seating Ambassador Jalfari, recognized as Syria's ambassador, says the Russians, please come in and help us as allies. Iran, please come help us as allies. What is the United States doing here? So because you have different conditions and you have this public relations campaign in front of the American people, because remember, the reason we're fighting these wars is 9/11, and that was Al-Qaeda. So they have to be fighting Al-Qaeda. They were fighting ISIS, too, for a year and change before the Russians went in and showed like in 6 weeks you could take out what it was taking them, a year to do. So I think that, that what seems contradictory, where they're going after Al-Qaeda here and they're driving them out of the city towards another battlefield there or whatever, must fit, on somebody's map, must fit into some larger plan. You can get glimpses of it looking at it. I can't answer the whole question.
Thank you very much. Mr. Morrell, is Hillary Clinton's vision right for America?
So first let me just say, I don't speak for Hillary Clinton, but I can tell you why I support Hillary Clinton and what I understand her policy positions to be and why I think she would be the better president for every American. And I'll start with, to go back in history with Don, I'll start with Ronald Reagan, in that since 1981, and Ronald Reagan assumed office in January of 1981, our country has slowly retrenched from providing the basic level of safety net in this country, the basic level of investment in a country to make it thrive and make it prosperous and make its workforce be able to actually live a good middle class, a good life for both parent and child. And so I think over 2 Reagan terms, a Bush term, 2 previous Clinton terms, and 2 Bush Jr. terms, I think that the country has moved extremely away from even the center, and we've become a center-right country that I think the current president we have has spent the better part of the last 8 years trying to rebalance. And so I see this election as, in many ways, I think it is a choice of Hillary Clinton in her own right, but I also think it's a validation of the legacy of Barack Obama, which was to reorient the country in such a place where government is no longer seen as a force of evil, but as a force that can actually do good and impact people's lives on a day-to-day basis. That's not to say that government is the answer for everything, but it is to say that we shouldn't strangle government. We shouldn't try to cut off blood to the arms and legs of government, but we should make sure that it's healthy and it's operating the way it should be, so that most of us, so that it impacts our lives in a very good and a very positive way. I think right now we're also at a point in this country largely driven by 8 years worth of trying to delegitimize the president we currently have, originally with coded language, but much more forthright and open and frankly honest language from some extreme elements of this country. I think that we're at a place now where the jingoism, the xenophobia, the outright racism that has creeped into our politics demands that we not allow for as divisive a figure as Donald Trump to ever step foot in the White House. Words matter, and Don pointed out accurately. There are things you can look at Hillary Clinton and judge her by her words and her record. Likewise, you can judge Donald Trump by his words. And Donald Trump's words tell you exactly what a presidency, what the United States will look like under him. I think it was the Boston Globe that did a chilling mock front page of what it would look like in July after Donald Trump assumed the presidency. And they were reporting on what they assumed would happen based on what he said. And it was talking about a mass exodus of people of color in this nation, primarily Latino. It had talked about camps that were set up in order to ensure that Muslims in this country were somehow not terrorists. It talked about an isolationist policy of engagement around the world in which our economic interests abroad were no longer considered because he set up exceptionally insane trade policies. And so, I take all of that threat very seriously. I take the fact that in today's America, with a candidate like Donald Trump who brings out the very worst in people, we have a situation where police and community relations are now at a point where there is little to no trust on all sides. And the last thing that we need is a president who's going to foment that continued distrust, when it's not just simply about talking points, it's about lives, oftentimes young black men and their lives. And so I think to put and elevate a man like that to the office of president is not simply asking for trouble, but fundamentally questioning whether our democracy can continue the way we expect it to and we hope it to. But let me tell you about Hillary Clinton and why I support Hillary Clinton. I think Hillary Clinton, and we have a similar political evolution. I've been in politics my entire adult life. I thought I was a conservative when I first got into politics. Similarly, Hillary Clinton, when she first entered politics, came from a fairly conservative, an old school conservative, what we would consider today probably a New York Democrat. But nonetheless, at the time, she grew up in a Republican household. In fact, she was a Goldwater girl. Over time, through education, through political activism, her worldview expanded. She became liberal. She became a progressive. But she's never sort of been the kind of individual politically who is unwilling to compromise and find common ground. I'm not a purist on anything. I'll take 51% of before I take 0 any day of the week. And I'm not saying that Hillary Clinton is on sort of the continuum of ideological scale as a 51% Democrat, but I don't think she's a purist. I don't think that she is so wedded to sort of the orthodoxy of the Democratic Party, or so wedded to liberalism or radicalism that she'd be unwilling to compromise with Republicans. I look at her record after getting lashed on an attempt to reform the United States healthcare system. She was still able to work with members of the other side of the aisle in order to get not comprehensive health insurance, but certainly she got health insurance for poor children throughout the United States. After Tom DeLay was the person who, one of the leaders of the impeachment of her husband, she worked with Tom DeLay in order to pass some very progressive legislation around making adoption easier throughout the United States. I think also as a father of a daughter, something that strikes me, there are two sort of personal anecdotes that strike me. One is, this was just last year, my daughter came home from school, from pre-K, and we were talking about the presidential election, and we were talking about Hillary Clinton, and how Dad likes Hillary Clinton, and I said, she's going to be the president, and she says to me, Ernesto doesn't have girl presidents, and I couldn't figure out what she was trying to tell me. Ernesto was her pre-K teacher. In Ernesto's classroom, he had all the presidents lined up on the wall. Well, Ernesto didn't have a girl president, and so my daughter had no concept of that even being possible, because Ernesto doesn't have girl presidents, how can I have a girl president? And I also think about my son Zachary, who's now 9, and he was an infant for the tail end of the Bush administration, but the only president he has known is an African-American named Barack Obama, and I imagine a world in which he never knows until down the road a white male president. In fact, he has a chance of being born to the first African-American president. He has a chance to see the first female president of the United States. And frankly, I figure after 200 some odd years, that's okay with me if we have a little bit of diversity leading the country. I actually, as you mentioned, I did some work with Senator Clinton, before she was Senator Clinton, when she was running for New York. And what I was always impressed with her by is, and I've worked for female candidates before, and what I've always been impressed by is the fact that, and President Obama said it best, women who run for office actually have to do everything the boys do, but backwards and in high heels. And I can tell you firsthand, having most recently worked on the New York City mayor's race for a candidate who wound up losing the race, Christine Quinn, the level of expectation for a female candidate is very different than the expectation of a male candidate. And let me explain to you. So there's a great book written by, I believe it's Robert Caro, called Master of the Senate, written about Lyndon Johnson. And the entire thesis of it is that here was this tough SOB from Texas, who when he needed to get something done and get legislation passed, he didn't mind grabbing you by the collar and buttonhole you in a corner. He didn't mind cutting a deal with you to take care of your needs back in your district. He didn't mind raising his voice. He didn't mind cutting deals. He got things done. He was called the Master of the Senate. When someone like a Hillary Clinton or Christine Quinn behaves in the very same fashion and gets things done, they're seen as politicians or unlikable or loud or crass. And it is a very difficult road to toe. And frankly, it's the research shows for female politicians, it's our fault, actually. It's not their fault. It's our fault in that we actually do not want the same behavior in a female politician that we want in a male politician. We do not like a female politician behaving like a male politician. We expect different things of her. And I think the knock on Hillary Clinton over the years of unlikable, she's a deal maker, she will compromise, she'll have a public position and a private position. Those are the very same things that we say were great about Rudy Giuliani. Those were the very same things we said were great about people like Anthony Weiner. They were tough, they said what's on their mind, they got things done. So I think to some degree, if we can step back from sort of looking at assessing Hillary Clinton along the lines of she's a politician, she cuts deals, she's tough, she says one thing, does another. So did Mitt Romney, so did John McCain, so did Barack Obama, so did Bill Clinton, so did Ronald Reagan. But look at whether you think the person can actually do the job before them. And there is no doubt in my mind, whether you agree with Hillary Clinton on nothing, that you cannot walk away not thinking she has the capability to be the commander-in-chief and the president of the United States. You cannot walk away thinking that under her leadership, the pinnacles of our democracy could crumble. And I think the opponent in this case, that's a clear threat. I think that Hillary Clinton is the only person in this race who has talked about criminal justice issues, racial equality issues, civil rights issues. That has been completely and utterly absent in her opponent's campaign. She is the only person in the campaign who has talked about a need to raise the federal minimum wage, to come up with economic policies that can rise all tides. And so, I say to you, take people at their word, take Donald Trump at his word, take her at her word. If we're just going to listen to words or we're just going to look at records, I don't dispute that Hillary Clinton has made mistakes in her political career. I could name a dozen senators or congresspeople who were either arrested, found cheating on their spouses, all got reelected and got put into office again. People make mistakes. People do bad things in politics. But what I'm telling you about Hillary Clinton is none of her behavior or any action she's taken in the public policy sphere or anything other than the actions that we actually respect in a lot of other politicians. And the one thing I would just go back to, sort of the notion of a sort of public position versus a private position. The fact of the matter is, legislating is a bit like sausage making. You actually, most of the time, you don't want to see it. There's a reason why the Supreme Court still fights against having cameras in the courtroom, because they're afraid the day the cameras come in the courtroom, though you can walk into the Supreme Court and watch everything take place, the minute you put a camera in the courtroom, the behavior changes. You've got folks who are now actually maybe not necessarily doing what they believe is best in the argument of the case or in challenging the attorneys, but playing through cameras into public opinion. Public opinion says that there should be a flag burning amendment in this country, that you should not be able to burn the American flag. I don't burn an American flag. I personally don't believe you should. But the Constitution says if you want to burn the American flag, you should. If we were, you can. If we were to simply always sort of operate in the public lens, there's a reason why our founders were smart enough to create the so-called body of the people, the House, and sort of the Senate to simmer tensions down. There's a reason why that process is slow. It's so that passion, like Donald Trump, like populism, doesn't work its way immediately into public policy. And so I think someone like Hillary Clinton, who says, you have to have a private position, which is your negotiating position with your adversary or your colleague or someone you're working with, versus your public position, there are strategies that go into getting things done and getting legislation passed. So I don't have a lot of quarrel with that. But lastly, I would just go back to the simple fact that do we want to be a country in which we work to bring people together, to find ways in which to have conversation about difference, or do we want to ride the back of fear and anxiety and then stoke the very, very real and very frightening rhetoric that is going on today? And I just come down on every step of the way that that's just simply not an option. And so despite my adoration of Hillary Clinton, regardless, I just simply think the American public, any rational thinking person, there's really no choice. It is Donald Trump in a very dark future, or someone who can run the country, and you can be confident that even if you don't agree with her on everything, that you've got an adult in the White House.
Thank you, Mr. Morey. Maybe two questions for Mr. Morey. Yes, that says.
Can you talk a little bit about Hillary Clinton's international policy? That there's been some statements about it. Do you consider that those statements about Hillary Clinton's position on pressing international issues, was that statement accurate or inaccurate? In other words, is Hillary Clinton pursuing a policy of confrontation with Russia, Eastern Europe, in the Middle East? Is she endorsing a policy of confrontation with China in the South China Sea and East China Sea? Is she pursuing a policy of rollback in Central America and South America? Is she pursuing a policy of militarization, militarized intervention in Africa? That's international, right? Because there's been some clear statements here tonight. That's her policy. I want to know, do you see that also, or do you see something else? International. If she's about something else, I want to know.
Yeah.
Now, domestically, she has a record, right? She was very much a part of her husband's administration. As such, she endorsed domestically a uniform crime bill that has had a catastrophic effect on a number of African Americans and Latinos, importantly, incarcerated. She was part of, she was in her husband, she was the first lady when her husband ended, as a popular expression goes, welfare as we know, or welfare ceased to be an entitlement, all right? might also want to talk about what her position is on local order. In other words, there are domestic positions that are important to people, right? There are international positions that are important to people. And it's nice that she may, in fact, become the first woman president, all right? But women presidents can do just what male presidents have done, you know? She can be no worse than other presidents who are male. See, that's not my issue, whether she can be as good or as bad. So I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about policy. What is she saying she's going to do? Is she abandoning, what do you call, R2P? You know, for instance, this interventionist orientation under the guise of humanitarian, you know, relief. Is she prepared to seek reconciliation with the Soviet Union and withdrawal of military presence in Eastern Europe as manifested in NATO and things of this nature? If not, then I want to know, you know, what she intends to do. Domestically, right? Is she going to reverse the militarization of domestic police forces which has occurred under every president from Johnson right on through Obama? Right? Is she going to be able to put programs in place that will save public education in the United States? Right?
Let's give Mr. Morrell an opportunity.
Sure. So I'm going to answer all that, but I will challenge you on one thing. I don't hold my wife accountable for my decisions. I'm certainly not going to hold Hillary Clinton accountable for her husband's decisions. I think that's a unfair standard. But let me go over what I do know about her policy on many of these issues. So she's the only candidate in this race that has proposed national guidelines for the use of force for police throughout the United States. She has proposed $1 billion to fund training programs and actually admits that there is implicit bias in our institutions in this country. She's actually committed $1 billion in her federal budget to training programs around implicit bias. She actually has she's proposing to eliminate the disparities in sentencing around crack cocaine and powder cocaine. She supports the President's initiative to the end of privatization of prisons at the federal level and also would like to incentivize states to do the same. She has $2 billion committed in her proposal to end the school-to-prison pipeline. She has $25 billion for the expansion of jobs targeted to felons who leave the criminal justice system. And I don't think, it doesn't take a lot to turn on the news and recognize that she is the only candidate in this race who believes that there need to be federal background checks so that people can get access to guns in this nation to eliminate the kind of crime that happens in cities like New York, who actually the guns don't come from New York, they come from places that don't have a lot of gun laws. So, I say on questions of no doubt, I think she'd be the first to admit, as would most folks from the 1990s, that the degree to which folks moved in the criminal justice system and towards a penal, sort of focus more on the penal side than actually on the rehabilitation side, I think that she would admit, as would most politicians on both sides of the aisle, suggest that we went too far. In fact, just last week, I was with a candidate who's running for district attorney in Westchester County. He was a Mount Vernon city judge, and it was heartening to hear him admit at the time that he too has to accept responsibility as a judge in the 1980s when it came to some of the sentences that were handed down for people who were involved in possession of things like crack cocaine. So I do think that, as with many things, research does inform. And one of the things that I think is impressive about Hillary Clinton is her ability to look at policy, look at data, and make decisions around that. As far as international affairs go, look, I would fundamentally disagree with the notion, and I know she certainly would, that we should extricate ourselves from Eastern Europe. I think the greatest, stability since World War II, most stability in terms of sort of massive World War-style conflict is a credit to the most enduring alliance that has probably ever existed, which is NATO. Donald Trump has suggested that we'll somehow extricate ourselves from NATO. If that's the case, and you think that she is going to perpetuate war, imagine if there was not the threat in Eastern Europe, if Russians were not staring down the notion that an attack on an Eastern European country could trigger NATO. Imagine the march, not through the Ukraine, but imagine the march through the Balkans, the Baltic states. I also would say to you, look, I think I'll criticize this president on the fact that his hands-off approach to Syria, after making a very clear and utter line in the sand about what action the United States would take if someone used mustard gas on their own people. I don't think all you have to do is pick up a newspaper and see.
No, what you have to
pictures.
do is check the facts. The newspaper
Hold on. The fact of the matter is, the people of Syria have been left to fend for themselves. There was a commitment made by the administration that if there were any chemical agents used, that the United States, there would be consequence. What that consequence was, I don't know. Do I think Hillary Clinton would advocate a ground war in Syria? No. She's been clear that she would support a no-fly zone in Syria. I think that as far as international affairs go and expertise, she was the Secretary of State. There's no question in this election who has the ability to actually sit across the table and negotiate with someone in the interest of American public safety and our interest abroad. I just don't think that, I think Donald Trump has proven time and time again, if a tweet can set this man off, imagine what a heated conversation with a world leader could do. So I guess, would I miss anything that you...
Thank you. We're going to move on to a couple of questions.
Could I respond to some of that too? I know you could do, that little back.
Please.
Okay.
Very briefly.
In terms of tweets, we came, in terms of tweets and temperament and judgment and no-fly zones, as a matter of fact. After the United States secured resolutions 1970 and 1973 from the UN Security Council imposing a no-fly zone on Libya, essentially meaning that Libya couldn't defend its own airspace. And after the reason for that was given was that there was a threat by the government of Libya to use aerial force against protesters, quote-unquote, as they were described at the time. We've gotten to know them better now. The United States then conducted an air war that ran from March until October of 2011. Now, on one day in June, typical of it, and Libya, by the way, let people know, is a country of 6 million people, was a country of 6 million people. The city of Tripoli, about 2 million, which is about the population of Manhattan, for example. The world has been on fire since September 11th of 2001 when 2 jetliners were used as projectiles smashed into 2 buildings in lower Manhattan. That devastation was so catalyzing for a nation of 300 million people that we had to go to war against the world, because that's where terrorism lives. On one afternoon in June of 2011, I was talking with a friend of mine, Cynthia McKinney, who was on the ground there, with a delegation from the African Union. And I'm hearing explosions in the background. And there was, she told me, and the guy she was with told me, from 11 in the morning until 11 at night, every day, they had bombing raids on this city of 2 million people. That was the no-fly zone that was supposed to protect Libyans from their government flying a couple of planes and dropping firecrackers out of them or whatever. So the no-fly zone that was imposed was actually the aerial cover for Al-Qaeda's takeover, with the Qatari military providing the command and control. There was photographs of them. They were in their uniforms and everything on the streets of Tripoli and Sirte and a whole bunch of other cities in Libya. And the same no-fly zone now is what they're trying to impose, because the Syrian government and Russia and Syria's allies are able to defend themselves thus far against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and they want to tip the balance to allow them to do to Syria what's been done to Libya. And what's been done to Libya is about a quarter of the population has either been killed or driven out. What was the richest country on the African continent is devastated, and the people that live there are living with terrorists or war around them. And that's what Hillary Clinton wants to complete in Syria.
Thank you very much, Mr. DeBar. Mr. P.A.P.A. Well, I'm going to ask a few questions, and then I'll come back to the audience, please. Now, we are about 22 days away from this election, and there are calls for a revolution should the Republican candidate not win. What are some of your thoughts on that? I'll start with you, Mr. Morey.
I think it's incumbent upon Republican Party officials and elected officials throughout the country, regardless of who they're supporting for president, to actually articulate support for the electoral system in the country, to ensure that that kind of fermentation of fear and anxiety and, frankly, conspiracy theory silliness does not influence people's behavior and cause them to behave recklessly. I mean, you've got Donald Trump suggesting that in Philadelphia, and the message is it's hardly coded, that in Philadelphia, that somehow majority black city is somehow going to, people are going to show up to the polls dozens and dozens and dozens of times and vote. Election fraud is practically a farce. It almost never happens in the United States of America. There are, I think, you could probably count on one hand an instance in which anyone who is dead ever showed up somehow voting in the United States of America. It is the notion that you need voter ID or you need some sort of enhanced security at the voting booth is a fairy tale that was crafted in order to keep certain segments of our country from actually voting. I think you'd be hard-pressed if you think about places like Texas, where your license to carry a gun will allow you to get into a voting booth, but your college ID will not. What does that tell you about who they want to vote and who they don't want to vote? So I think it is incumbent upon officials of all parties to stop that kind of rhetoric. I think it's dangerous. I think that we need to, for as faulty as our institutions can be, I think we need to present a message that suggests that we have faith in the electoral process in this country, which is run at the local level. And that's important to remember. When you go to vote, it's usually your neighbor, or I bet you half a dozen people from Wesley Hall who are actually running the elections. So if you think they're all involved in some massive voter fraud, those are the people who are running elections across the country. And I'd say that the elected officials in charge in the states, the swing states that are currently being contested right now, are run almost overwhelmingly by Republicans. So if there's a fraud occurring, then it is some sort of real conspiracy between Republican leadership in swing states who somehow want Hillary Clinton to win an election. I just think that rhetoric is dangerous, and we should all, regardless of who we support, really, really step back from that.
Thank you, Mr. DeBar. Do you have any comments on that?
Now, I think it's interesting to have an opinion essentially that the idea of voter fraud is farcical. I don't know, 2000, 2004. I remember in 2008, the primaries here in New York, there was one district in Harlem where supposedly Barack Obama didn't get a single vote.
But that's not fraud, that's just technical error.
Well, wait, let me finish. Okay, well, no. Well, I'm going to get to that, because that's actually at the heart of all of this, because we're talking about the election and not just these two candidates, but the entire electoral system in this country, as if that is some mechanism for people to express their policy wants and needs and have them actualized. And that is the farce. That isn't what happens at all. And it's not just because there's money in the system, and it's not just because the media has, is not an honest broker, but just its nature. It's because the system was designed that way. You have to look at the foundation of this country. This country was based on the theft of land, the genocide of the people that were on it, the enslavement of other people to develop it, and the system was constructed to enable, A, the maintenance of the wealth that was attained through that, and B, the ability to extend it around the world, which we're seeing actualized. We've been seeing it actualized since the beginning. This country has been at war for almost every single year of its existence. That's something to really ponder. What's happened with elections in the United States in terms of just the formal elections, you can look at American Blackout, a movie that documents electoral fraud. Voting machines, voter caging, vote suppression, a whole myriad of techniques that are highly developed techniques that people that are political operatives in both parties know how to play. And they play it. And that is something that's happening in a larger context in this particular election that I think is important. And the fact that this issue is coming up right now, I think, is really important. We've been watching a degradation of the condition of working people in this country, a serious one. I mean, if you want to go back to Taft-Hartley even, or whatever, the beginning of the deconstruction of the New Deal, that's accelerated at various points. But certainly, since the 1970s, again the 1980s, again the 1990s, as the global economy was refashioned to favor low-wage, markets, and finance capital acquired a more powerful role in governing, and the immigration laws were tailored to allow free flow of labor on the one hand, but not labor deciding that, but rather labor being driven out of its own countries by things like NAFTA, which devastated the agricultural sector in Mexico and drove people from Mexico to here. All of these little things that make up this big soup that we're looking at now have given working people in this country, and for the first time over the last 30 years or so, even white workers who thought they were privileged enough to not have to deal with this, not just a feeling of insecurity, but staring in the face of deprivation. Millions of foreclosures, evictions everywhere. The laughable 4% unemployment rate that doesn't count about 15% of the working population because they're out of the game. They know they can't get a job, they're not getting benefits, they don't count anymore. There's actual desperation here that we saw expressed in this election behind Sanders, and we see behind Trump, and we see people in the streets. Black Lives Matter, all these different, things that are coming up from the community. People being murdered is a catalyst for that, and it happening with impunity is a catalyst for that. But desperation is driving it. That's even more fundamental. The working class in this country, with the legacy of racism and anti-worker war, basically, is still standing up where it is, in place. And the project for the elite that's scared to death, watching parts of the world break away, the rise of multilateralism internationally, the BRICS, all these different things, they're scared to death. They're trying to suppress. They have to suppress it. They don't have a lot of tools left anymore. They can't do Keynesian fixes and blow air into the economy. They got all the wealth already. It's like there was a class war. They won. Now what? And the people are starting to stand up. In this election, the natural unity that should have been developed among the working class sectors that are in the streets and people behind Sanders, that was thwarted. You can see an affirmative effort to do it. The theft of the primary election by the Clinton campaign from Sanders, looking at the State Department standards, where if you have a vector between the exit polls and the actual recorded vote of 15% or more, the United States doesn't recognize that election. Looking at the Democratic primary, and there's litigation on this right now with the firm down in Jersey, Bob Fitrakis, a lawyer out in Ohio, is doing. Some of the primaries here, the vector was up to 28% between the exit poll and the actual vote. And by their calculus, if the exit polls were right, Sanders should have won on the first ballot at the Democratic National Convention. That election was stolen, and forgetting that kind of affirmative theft, looking at everything that happened at the DNC, the rules were broken, the law was broken for nonprofits and for that type of corporation. So it's not a fantasy to think that there's going to be electoral theft. Final point. The working class is learning a very slow lesson in like 3 stages over the last few years with all of these things that's happened. The first came with the Occupy movement, where the concept of class, simple and elemental, the 1% and the 99%, diffused among the working class like wildfire, to where it's now part of the norm. That's how people look at things. That's a 6-year-old, 5-year-old concept in our culture. And the idea of a rigged system is now also in the lexicon, not just among people that support Trump, among people that support Sanders, and Sanders was saying it, and the reason that they both are saying it isn't because they want to change it, it may or may not be, it's because they know that people are feeling that.
Are you saying that the dangerous rhetoric that we're hearing from the Republican campaign or supporters, Trump supporters, is justified? Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is the system is rigged, the election may well be stolen, the working class, as divided as it is, needs to find some solution to that problem, and with the entire elite aligned with Clinton, the same Republicans that the Democrats used to organize for the last 40 years against are standing shoulder to shoulder with her. Somebody has to try to find a way to take the working class and stitch it together, because guess what? Nobody's going to make a revolution without the white working class. Nobody's going to make a revolution without the black people in this country, particularly the working class, or with anyone. The working class needs to build unity. And right now you have unity only in one place. That's among the elite. They're with Clinton. And when Trump or anyone else says they'll steal the election, yeah, it's quite possible. It's not absurd. And so we have to figure out a solution.
Can I just chime in on
Let's put this out here.
Sure.
But what about issues that face the African American community? What is your candidate prepared to do? Have they identified some of these issues, and what are some of the solutions for the African American?
Sure, hold on.
I'm sorry.
So if you think for a second that any of the economic anxiety or the working class problems are going to be solved by Donald Trump, I have a Taj Mahal to sell you in Atlantic City. The fact of the matter is Donald Trump doesn't care about working people. But actually, I want to go back to the notion that somehow an election was stolen from Bernie Sanders. No, Hillary Clinton won an election because she appealed to a diverse constituency. Hillary Clinton is the nominee because African Americans voted for her and Latinos voted for her. Bernie Sanders did not do the kind of outreach that was necessary in order to build confidence from African Americans and Latinos in this country. So to suggest that somehow it was stolen, in my mind, actually takes legitimacy away from the people who put her in the position she is now, which is the Democratic nominee.
I'm just using the State Department standards.
So
okay?
I think
that's the U.S. State Department that
silly.
she worked with, by the way.
It's silly to say
those were her standards.
By that measure, then
that was the standard they applied to Iran, for example.
By that measure, then the
State.
diverse coalition she put together to win the nomination was somehow a part of this massive conspiratorial fraud that's going on. And I'll also add, Bernie Sanders is supporting Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
But
Bernie Sanders isn't the
point.
Hold
on. So in terms of, but I think that leads into your next question, which is, there's a reason why Hillary Clinton is the nominee in the Democratic Party, because if you know a little bit about Democratic Party politics,
and I do.
Who are their constituencies? Primarily people of color. They're the backbone of the Democratic Party as well as women in this nation. And Hillary Clinton put together a diverse coalition that actually more is representative of this nation as a whole. That got her through the primary process. That put her in the position to be the nominee. That will frankly be what drives her to why she will likely win the presidency, because you cannot win an election in this nation if the only people voting for you are white men. But let me tell you some of the things that she talked about and is proposed to do, which is why I think that she'll be I think she will be successful, and I think that she'll be the better president for people of color in this country. One, if you just simply take a look at issues like, I think one of the most illustrative parts of this campaign so far has actually not been Trump and Clinton, it has been the debate between Mike Pence and Tim Kaine, in which Pence just could not come to terms with admitting that implicit bias existed in our institutions from top to bottom in this nation. And somehow the notion that implicit bias exists is somehow an indictment of the entire law enforcement community. That's the way they see things. And in fact, no, that's not to say that we don't have really great law enforcement officials in this country, but that you cannot suggest that implicit bias does not exist. So the fact is, Hillary Clinton not only talked about it, but she also has a program. She's actually laid out policies to address implicit bias. She's actually made a commitment to fund $1 billion worth of training in law enforcement across the country to deal with implicit bias. The sheer fact that she recognizes it and will say it publicly, I think should give you some indication of her worldview versus her opponent's worldview. As I said before, $25 billion to train ex-felons in order to get back in the workforce. workforce, a fundamental changing of sentencing disparities, whether it's with drugs or whether it's violent crime versus nonviolent crime. If you look at her position on body cameras, she's willing to invest billions of dollars in order to ensure that body cameras exist in police forces across the country. And not just because then you have a public record of the actual interchange between a person of color and the police officer, but also to build confidence within the police department and the public that when there is an actual altercation in which a police officer is justified in using force, it's a record. So she's nuanced. She's talked about the issues that actually matter to the African American community and Latinos in this country. She's talking about making sure that if a child was born in the United States, irrespective of where their parents went, it is bad family values to send their parents back to Ecuador because they're not from here. She supports rational immigration policy. We have to be kind to Donald Trump, we have a fairly racially ignorant man as the head of the Republican Party right now, who, if you think for a second at the top of the heap in the White House, is somehow going to be able to even touch the tip of the iceberg when it comes to issues that matter to the African American community, well, you're just fooling yourself. So, again, I take exception to the notion that somehow this election was stolen from Bernie Sanders. I think that's an affront to the people who voted for Hillary Clinton. Do I suspect politics? I've been in politics a long time. Politicians do politics. Do I think there were people in the DNC who liked Hillary Clinton more than Bernie Sanders? Absolutely. Do I think that Bernie Sanders all of a sudden became a convert to gun control after he knew it was a problem for him in the African American community? Yes, I do. I don't think Bernie Sanders is a big fan of gun control, but he's a politician. So is she. I don't hold her to any greater standard than I do Bernie Sanders, but I certainly don't dismiss her voters.
First of all, the audience with some questions.
You're talking about how Hillary Clinton stole from Bernie Sanders, and then you're just saying overall like corruption and then voting and stuff like that. But Donald Trump is corrupt himself. He has all this money still for me to say things about his taxes, and it had to come through like privately. So I don't understand if he can't be public about his decisions, and then also like as we were talking about like, the African American community, the Latino community. I have a lot of Latino friends. I have a lot of African American friends. Like white people aren't like a lot of people that friends with, especially in middle school. So I'm just saying, like, if he needs to be in touch with them, he needs to know what they want. He hasn't really, I got a small $1 million for my dad. I get like $10 from my dad, but I love my dad. But the thing is, like, he doesn't work. He takes credit for work that maybe his father did or even before that. And so he doesn't understand, like, how you have to work to get where you need to be. How, like, he doesn't understand what he does is corrupt, supposedly. He's childish. He's childish. I know kids in my school who I don't like how they act, but he's still more childish than them. He still does more corrupt things than kids in the school. He can't get his act together, and he doesn't know how to reach out to the different communities of people. He insulted a Muslim.
Okay. Do you want to respond?
Yeah. How old are you?
I'm 13.
You're very bright. This is something I learned late in life because I started to do television when I was like 30-something, which is a few weeks off for you at least. and it's something that's so obvious after you process it and recognize it that you can't believe that you didn't see it before, but in fact you don't because you're used to engaging with television in a particular way. What you see on television, and that's, I assume you've never met Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, or if you did, it was like a little quick hand, glad handing or whatever. You certainly haven't sat down and discussed policy with them, watched them assemble whatever information they do, and process a policy out of that, whatever. Nor have I, by the way. And so, and we may both be better off because we haven't. But most of what all of us learn about these people comes through very short little slices of video on television that's assembled by people that have an agenda, whatever the agenda is. The agenda might be to make you like nature, and so they'll put a lot of streams and mountains and things in it, and the people speaking gently, strolling through that, you get a nice feeling for it. And it's like, what do you think of nature? Oh man, nature's great. You see that? And all of this. They also use it to sell things. You notice that there are commercials. In fact, the basis of our media is, sales, selling stuff. That's how it was financed. Its development was financed. They sell ideas too, and they sell images, and they sell impressions of political candidates. The one thing that an elite doesn't want the rest of a political grouping, the people, to do is have input, real input, into the development of policy of the society with the force of it actually being implemented. In other words, not only do we get to have the conversation and honestly figure out what we all really need, but also we certainly aren't going to be allowed to then say, here's what's going to happen and force it to happen. And the media is owned and programmed by the very same elite that doesn't want us to do that. So you have to, the word that people use nowadays is virtual, but the word that philosophers use essentially is they distinguish between the apparent and the real, or the material, or the essential. And you had a very vivid description of Donald Trump just then that you communicated. And there's some factual, basis in it. He's a rich guy. His father gave him $1 million. Little anecdotal things that get assembled into what people call a narrative. But it's not the same as what has actually happened. Now, I don't know a thing about him personally. The only engagement I ever had with him, in fact, I was fighting a project he was brought into in White Plains, pretty aggressively, as a matter of fact. And as I recall, the Democratic leadership in Westchester County helped fund that project. And Hillary Clinton was at the party that helped fund, and also, this is Capelli's project in downtown White Plains. When I was fighting Capelli in Ossining, trying to take our waterfront, and the only way, even though we had the whole community out in the street, they still went ahead with it. I thought, I know how to do it. Everywhere else he has a project, I'm going to go organize there too. So I went to White Plains, and we stopped it halfway through. They ended up bringing Trump in. Hey, Donald, put your sticker on the other side. We'll be able to move this through. And that's what happened. And while that happened, Hillary Clinton, the Democratic committee, the Republican committee, they were all on the same side against us. Now, that gets portrayed one way on television, but what actually happened, I saw. And so my answer is, that guy you're describing is a horrible human being. Okay? I don't really know what kind of a politician he'll make, and I do know some of the things that he's done, and I know a lot of people in business that have done the same thing. What I also know is that Hillary Clinton's actual policies, her husband's policies and hers, and she was an active part of that administration. She wasn't just the wife. She was an actor. She was somebody who was, she's a lawyer, she's smart, and they sold this, and she lobbied, and she helped to craft policy. There are millions of dead people in this country because of those policies. There are hundreds of thousands more people in prison, black and brown, in the main, as a result of those policies. She now wants to undo some of that because she saw the light. When she was in the Senate from 2001 until 2008, never occurred to her to propose any legislation to fix it then. That's yeah, I'm sorry.
All right, I'm going to come on to some of you and see if you have something that you want to add, or ask you to keep your comments so minimal, please. You can start. Yeah, coming this way.
Don.
Yeah. So yeah, media has a role, and from what I understand, you just said is that the media, we're only seeing bits and pieces of what the politicians are, and that might be true to some extent. But with social media now, especially with Donald Trump live tweeting and the things that he says, I mean, it makes sense to what Sage just said. I mean, the guy it's not the media pretending or portraying him in a certain way. It's him.
Wow.
This is who he is. This is who he's saying he is through his live tweet and through social media. So, I mean, I agree with you on one hand that, the media represents a certain thing, but at the same time, this individual represented himself through his tweets.
Let me just 90-second response, because this is something that's kind of unique too. One of the things that I do every day is I prepare a 30-minute radio newscast where I have to look at everything that happened in the world, which I'm monitoring all to an obsession, decide what we're going to talk about today, for 90 seconds or 20 minutes in a feature story or whatever, and decide how to present it. So you have to try to get an honest understanding of all the facts involved. There's a tremendous amount of work that goes into it. For example, an argument over what happened in Syria doesn't just require looking at the New York Times and this and that. It requires listening to a 30-minute speech that somebody gave at the United Nations, and maybe another 20-minute speech somebody gave in Europe or whatever. Listening to all these things, following it up, and all of that. Believe me, the virtual that we're seeing on television is not only not representative of it, it's crafted, and people that want to avail themselves of social media, just the amount of information that you have to sift through to understand what this snippet of Trump means, you got to listen to a 50-minute speech in its entirety. And nobody does that. And the media knows it, and that's why they're able to do what they do.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
I'm not voting for Donald Trump for obvious reasons. I'm also not voting for Hillary Clinton. Me for obvious reasons. I'm going to vote for the Green Party. And the Green Party's not going to win. We also know that. Right? The system is broken. The electoral system is totally broken. Right? But Hillary, in all probability, will be president. So I'm very interested in very close scrutiny of Hillary because she is, in fact, going to make decisions for the next 4 to 8 years. Right? And whether we as a people are going to thrive, right, we're going to die in the vomit, whether the planet's going to go up in a nuclear cloud, very much depends on our ability to hold Hillary Clinton accountable. Right? So criticisms of Hillary Clinton, I think, are in order and should not necessarily be interpreted as endorsing Donald Trump, who is doing a very good job
Of
of
electing.
sanitizing Hillary Clinton
Yep.
and driving more and more people to Clinton because of the obvious lack of popularity of his campaign. One last point. It takes a hell of a lot of study to know what the hell is going on. And do not start with the media. Alright? A hell of a lot of study. That it is profound. For instance, tonight there was some commentary about the founding fathers. There were 2 different interpretations of founding fathers. Right? Now one right, one wrong. You know what I mean? And our interpretation of that kind of history impacts everything that follows thereafter. There are things like the deep state
Right.
that nobody's mentioned today.
I started to. I almost
did.
did.
The falls on Hillary's ticket. You know what I mean? She can't be elected president. Somebody else will be elected president. Right? And the decisions that will probably be made will be quite similar to the decisions that would have been made if Hillary were elected president. And I was even weirder is that Donald Trump, God knows I don't believe it, but let's assume he's elected president. You may be very much surprised at what his administration looks like. It may not look to be too much different from Hillary Clinton's. Right? And this says something about what's really going on in society as opposed to, what elected politics means and the president, the personalities of the president and what have you. And this all takes place because of the relative quiescence of the population. Because we don't know what's going on, and therefore we don't participate in politics.
Thank you so much. Somebody else? Okay, I'll come here and then I'll come to you. Let me go in order, okay?
To you both, as I sit here tonight, right, this was supposed to be sort of a outside view of why one believes Hillary Clinton should be participating or be president versus the other side saying why they support Donald Trump. And some of what I hear tonight is, well, he or she can do this. Or will there be a revolution after this election? My question is, for anything to truly change, right, regardless of whether it's Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, they don't run the government in a box. They have a Congress, they have a Senate, and they have a House of Representatives. And in Don, your opinion, the main priority is what will happen nationally when it comes to outside influences, who we're going to go to war with and who we're not, and that is the main purpose or point of your opinion why Donald Trump, well, that's at least what I heard.
Yeah, it's just
versus Mike's opinion, which had a lot more to do with domestic policy. But my question is, at the end of this result, the individual who has at least, right, wrong, or indifferent, it's the system we have. And to make any change, unless the people in this audience and the rest of us who vote for different people in Congress, different people in the Senate, the president has, and we've witnessed it in the last 8 years, their hands are tied. So what solution, or how are the candidates, if they are elected president, going to work with the House and the Senate, which A, has the purse strings, and B, has what gets passed?
So is the question, what do you do? Is the question, what do you do in that?
Oh.
Or are you saying in the reality of what is?
Your candidate going to be able to work within the constraints of the government we have now, and is your candidate going to be able to work in those same constraints? Because we don't like to live in utopia where everything is perfect.
Right.
It just doesn't exist.
So I want to answer this two ways. So one, I think that if you accept the system as it exists today and the institutions as they were designed, then I think that it's very clear that both from experience and willingness to actually work across the aisle and compromise, that she would likely do a better job. I do think fundamentally, though, and I'm going to take a liberty here to sort of expand beyond your question, I think fundamentally the biggest challenge that we have institutionally is there has to be a willingness on a state-by-state level to change the way in which we draw congressional lines, because I think that at the end of the day drives the inability of folks in the Congress to actually work together and work with the president. Because I think what winds up happening is I'd rather have, maybe some folks would disagree, I'm no radical, I'd rather have us fighting over the middle. Because I think when you fight over the middle, you actually are more willing to compromise and find positions which are more livable for most people. That's not to say that, you know, we protect minority rights in this country regardless of where the center is. But I think that one of the institutional changes that need to happen is we need to, and I don't think it will come from the right, I only think it will come from the left, and that's simply not because they're so much better, but simply because they've been victimized more so in the last 25 years, 30 years from gerrymandering. But if we change congressional lines and remove the ability of politicians and state houses across the country to draw those lines, then I think you'll have districts in which you don't have a Republican fighting a Republican for who can be the most fringe Republican. You won't have a Democrat fighting a Democrat to be the most fringe Democrat. If it was a moderate district in which you get to the point where you have to, anyone can win, I think you'll have moderation and more compromise.
You want to say something?
Yeah, sure.
90 seconds.
There's so much to say, and
It's like the debates. Donald gets less time than Hillary.
This is a good format for this, but it's not a good format for me to communicate what I need to, because there's so much background information that I have to share for people to understand what I'm saying. Very briefly, I completely understand what Mike just said, and 8, maybe 12, 16 years ago, I would say, yeah, that's a sane approach to it. Today, with objective conditions being what they are, it's a rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic discussion. We are in a fundamental crisis, okay, at this point in time. It may get glossed over for a short while after the election. There may be some kind of apparent political honeymoon and all of that. The conditions of working people are desperate and they're not going to be relieved. There's no magic that's going to come out of some policy consensus in Washington. There has to be a redistribution of wealth. The only policy consensus that exists in Washington is that that's not going to happen, whether it's Hillary Clinton. As a matter of fact, the only one who hints at it is Trump, with some of the policies that he suggested. And I've discussed some of them with Dr. Richard Wolff. You know, economic policies. He's an economist. He's a pretty bright economist. He's a brilliant economist. You know, this won't work because, but things like repatriating a couple $1 trillion worth of money to the United States for investment won't work unless you do this, like perhaps nationalize the banks and find ways to actually get control of the money instead of letting people put it in the bank, because today there's tons of cash, but there's no way for the people to invest it productively under the existing conditions. We need a heavy government intervention in the economy. That's not on anybody's policy agenda, except Jill Stein, by the way. And that's the solution to our problems. Again, the rest of it, you know, doing redistricting, all this stuff, deck chairs on the Titanic, big iceberg coming.
Thank you so much.
You can't tell me it made me
There's
feel
a
bad.
famous saying says, socialism for capitalists, and capitalism and no socialism for the poor. It's a famous saying. And I like to say it's very disingenuous that Mike Morey comes here proselytizing with Hillary Clinton, and he wants us to forgive Hillary Clinton the crimes that she did to humanity. Same with Donald Trump. As African American people, we are a domestically conscious people and a globally conscious people also. And there's no way in the world that we're going to forget, act like Hillary Clinton wasn't together with her husband on the crime bill. No way in the world. We would never forgive her. We would not forgive her for what she did, the policies in Haiti that the Clintons did. They even voted for a 60 cent per hour wage. They voted it down, actually increased from 60 cents per hour. What they did in Africa, what they did in this whole support of the war in Libya, when Gaddafi, whatever you think of him, he was calling for a united Africa. He fixed the desert. He did the whole water system. And he was calling for a currency, an African currency. Hillary Clinton along, she's a thug. And Barack Obama, he's a thug too. Both of them, along with NATO, European forces, they bombed the heck out of Libya. And what happened? Colonel Gaddafi was saying that there was going to be a Al-Qaeda uprising. He told them that. And it happened. You know, I'm black man. Weird. No, all right. But what I'm saying is also the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Hillary Clinton, she wants to destroy the working class. You know, all of a sudden she's changed her mind on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Her and Barack Obama. And most of the Democrats don't even support it. Just about 99% of the Democrats don't support it. But she did. So she was going to do NAFTA all over again on the American working class. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm not a Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton supporter. I support either one. Both are equal. Both mean no good to us. But I probably won't vote, and I do vote, it would be for Stein or Barack. Barack, I mean, with his record as a human rights lawyer and activist and stuff, so that's where I'm going. But it's just very disingenuous. Like, you know, it's just white folks always want us to forgive people. We act like Hillary Clinton didn't know what she was doing. I went to the Paul Robeson thing yesterday at the Peace Corps Museum, and you had some people, you know, some folks on the panel, or some people in the audience. They just want to act like these people who participated in the two riots there, they just did it mistakenly because it was the time. So I don't know. Terrorism is terrorism. Hillary's a terrorist. She knows what she's doing, and she's evil, and we must oppose Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump.
not realizing what her politics were. So that's why she is where she is. And she was down with her husband during his term, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's not going to be the person running the show once she's in. Thank you.
Any comments? I'm coming around that one.
I just want to say I've been spending some time registering people to vote, and a lot of people have not wanted to register because they don't want to vote because they don't trust me, their candidates. I too feel like vote for a crooked. I just feel like one has more of their heads on their shoulders and has a filter when they speak, and that's important when you're speaking, especially like if you're so free to say things frivolously without any type of sensitivity to who you may be affecting during regular debates, then it becomes worrisome when you think about them dealing with other countries and how they may react to the things that come out their mouths so carelessly. And I often encourage people that didn't want to register to vote because they didn't trust either candidates to do to register to vote. Despite because if they change their mind last minute, they would still have the opportunity, but to also research the third parties, because if people did enough research and studying, like the professor was saying about people knowing what's going on, then maybe there will be a greater chance of a third party person winning if they took the time to do that, being that a lot of people are opposed to both Hillary and Trump.
Thank you very much. Ellie? Any comments on this side? Okay, Jim.
Bread and butter issues typically considered to be the determining factor in elections. We've had an economy that's barely increasing faster than the population. Something around 2%, the average, a little more than 2%. Trump has said that he wants to do something like reduce taxes in a particular way, and also reduce regulations, using a model which worked for the Kennedy administration, the Reagan administration, and the Clinton administration. So there's a track record there. What is Hillary Clinton going to do to boost the economy to deal with this problem?
Any takers?
Yeah.
I'm going to respond briefly. And we're going to take about 2 more questions, and then we'll call it a evening.
So I would start with challenging the notion that the tax policies of the Reagan administration or Reagan administration or the Bush administration actually did much. In fact, under Ronald Reagan, national debt was higher than it was under Bill Clinton, or in terms of proportion of what they added to it than Barack Obama. I'd also argue that the notion of trickle-down economics, which they promoted massive tax cuts at the highest rates, and to bring them down, and somehow that money trickles into the workforce. You can't argue that those things worked, and then have on the other side of me here saying that somehow the economic crisis we're in is because the average working person in the United States of America can no longer make anything. The reason they can't is because of those failed tax policies. So I would say to you that I don't accept the premise that those economic policies worked. I'd argue that in fact they didn't. And what I'd say to you is that the Hillary Clinton has proposed that what she would do is actually raise the highest rates. I think her threshold is 275. I don't remember what the exact number is. No tax increases at the middle or the lower rungs, but in fact most everything she's proposed is financed through an increased tax rate at the top. And I think that if, I'm not an economist, but I've heard about trickle-down economics my entire life, have seen the results of trickle-down economics, which requires massive debt and then also requires massive cuts to the social service safety net, which then, in fact, contributes to the fact that people can't make ends meet in this country. So I don't think that works. It's not what she has proposed. Does that answer the question?
I could I just say?
Yeah.
You said before you didn't think I was going to, you didn't expect me to attack you from the left. I didn't expect you to attack Reagan from the right.
I just want to thank both of you gentlemen, Mr. DeBar and Mr. Morey, for sharing your perspectives and views.
Okay.
But and I agree with what Mary Beth said, is that all politicians have their platforms, but they can't do this singularly. They have to have the cooperation of the legislatures. But for most of us, I think our choice is going to be who is going to be the best candidate for us. As a senior, having young men, having grandchildren, just trying to make sure that our future is relatively secure. We know that politicians make all sorts of promises that they can't really keep. But then you have to consider who is going to allow you to live the best life that you can live. And for me as a senior, and for future generations to come. And in terms of Mr. Trump, he says some things that are very erratic. And for me, a woman of color, very uncomfortable with it, and just a woman in general, very uncomfortable. Whereas Hillary Clinton, I understand that she won't be able to deliver all the things that she said, but perhaps she's the safest choice right now. Don't know. Have to wait and see.
I'm not an economist. I just put that out there.
Those saying it work was just a brief statement. It's based on income growth across all classes during those administrations. It wasn't just the Reagan administration, some Democrats too. I still didn't get your solution. You talked about debt, which is not really relevant to the question. What was the actual solution that Hillary Clinton was going to propose to deal with this?
Well, one thing in terms of plans on the jobs front, I can tell you that in terms of minimum wage, she's proposed a federal minimum floor of $12 an hour. There's the fact is, if you raise minimum wage for those who actually take in minimum wage, you're more likely to pump that in the economy because you're forced to. You don't save that. It's a very different approach than when you take cuts at the top, which those dollars don't generally get invested. They go to savings. They don't pump themselves back into the economy. She is in favor of mandatory paid sick leave, which would be a first for the United States of America and would finally catch us up to the rest of the world, which would mean if you get sick, if you have a baby, not only do you get guaranteed family medical leave, but you get guaranteed paid leave. I believe it's 2/3 of what your base salary is, you're still required to get. So those are some of the actual sort of dollars and cents, meat and potatoes kind of income building programs that she supports.
Okay, final comments, gentlemen?
Yeah. Just 45 seconds on the last thing. I take issue with and I know that the alignment in the debate, it actually seems a little dissonant, but I take issue with the idea that there was economic growth during any of those periods, because depending on how you define economic growth, the wealth of working class as a whole, and even the middle class as a whole, more or less was evaporated over the last 35, 40 years. Just looking at home ownership and equity in homes, savings in real terms, we've been impoverished as a class. And there may have been measures of economic activity that show GDP increase in this and growth in that vector of this and all of this. People are poorer than they were before, and they've been working harder. To me, that seems like an economy that is collapsing on itself. And that's been a steady trend through, I guess it started with Nixon, really, but it accelerated with Reagan, and those policies that Reagan introduced have been adopted by every administration since. Austerity for the working class is basically what the economic policy is.
We're wrapping it up.
Final comments, yes.
So I'd leave it with this. I would never profess to stand up here and tell you the candidate I support is perfect in any way, shape, or form. What I would profess to tell you is that the choices before you in this election, she is the only choice which you can expect some leadership that can be respected, leadership that doesn't threaten the foundation of our government, but also if you care about the Voting Rights Act, if you care about global warming, if you care about a woman's ability to make a decision about her own health care, if you believe in that we need criminal justice reform, if you believe we need immigration reform, if you believe the minimum wage should be raised to $12 an hour, if you believe that our alliances are important for the security of our country, if you believe that everyone should have access to the voting booth so long as they're 18 years old in the United States, then there aren't really many options in this race. And so I would say to you, think long and hard about whether you can accept 51% or nothing. And for those who are on the sort of fence or deciding, maybe I don't like her, there's something about her I don't like, I suggest if any one of those things matter to you, then the other candidate is simply not an option because that candidate supports none of those things. And as far as our future, look, I actually, I respect Don's perspective on and his concern, which is real, in some of the fundamental flaws of the institutions in this country. But I also I'm an eternal optimist, and I actually think that I've seen over the course of my short life, and also in a little bit of history, the ability to actually rise up when major challenges exist. We got through one awful economic collapse in the early part of the 20th century, and I think that we've recovered from a major economic collapse in the beginning of this century. I think that we have the capability, and if people are willing, we can actually make a substantial difference here and overcome some of the challenges that we face. I'm not a fan of blowing up the system. I believe that the system can be fixed. I believe it takes a lot of profiles and courage. I believe that there need to be structural changes to the system. But as far as this election goes, I think there's only one rational choice for President of the United States, that you can put your head down at night and know while things may not be perfect, you can rest assured that the democracy that has been built over the last 200 some odd years is not going to fall down around you because of a person who is unstable or unfit to be president.
I guess I'll wrap up to just touch a couple of things that I just heard here and from Mike and something that you said before, which was my emphasis on not having World War III. I mean, maybe it betrays some fetish I have for foreign policy or something, but it really isn't that. If we have World War III, everything else is academic. There's going to be no discussion about prison populations, about water supplies, about Muslims, about any of the things that we're talking about, human rights, civil rights, animal rights, everything. It's all gone. We're dead. The concern that I have about World War III being real, it's not in my imagination. It's Dr. Stephen Cohen, one of the most knowledgeable people about Russian affairs in this country, Professor Emeritus at NYU. We're closer to 12 o'clock than we were in October of 1962. Looking at the placement of forces, the actual shooting down of Russian planes by American proxies at helicopters and killing soldiers, with the Russians standing with the Chinese and the two presidents saying we now have a strategic alliance, while the United States is buzzing Chinese ships off the coast of China, while the United States is introducing THAAD missile systems into Korea that are anti-missile systems for China, while war is being deployed to the borders of Russia and China by this administration. To me, everything else pales in consideration. It doesn't mean I've been struggling on local and national issues my whole life, that they were it. Right now, let's not blow up the world so we can have a discussion about the rest of it, and that's why I've emphasized it. In terms of judgment on that particular point, Trump is the one that says it's a bad idea, no matter what he'll do. Clinton is not the one that says it's a bad idea, and this is her policy being laid out before us, as begun by Bill Clinton moving NATO to Russia's borders against the word that was given to Gorbachev by the U.S. that they wouldn't even go into East Germany.
Well, Mr. Morey, Mr. DeBar, thank you so much for your passionate and informed discussion. And thank you to all of you who have come out. God be with us all. Vote your conscience, your informed conscience, and we will continue to pray. Thanks again. Good night.